Trump is an autocrat, and when an autocrat tells you what he is and what he's going to do, we should believe him. Good afternoon and welcome to The Count, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is my co-host, Alana Sivan. It's Friday, October 9th. There are 25 days remaining until the election. And this is a show about that election, about existential threats to our democracy that are amassing right now as we speak, and a plot emerging from the Trump campaign to undermine our democracy and to steal this election. Alana, can you give us a rundown of what we're talking about, how we got here, and the specifics of the plot up to now?
So to start doing that, I'm going to read some of the quotes that we talked about yesterday, because I think they really frame what we're talking about and the thing that we're really scared of. So I'll start with Bart Gellman's article, The Election That Could Break America, and this quote that you can find in it. According to sources in the Republican Party and at the national and state levels, the Trump campaign is discussing contingency plans to bypass the election results and appoint loyal electors in states where Republicans hold legislative majorities. So this is something we are hearing from sources within the Republican Party. But that's not the only thing that we have to go off of. We have Trump's words that he has used himself. At the RNC this past August, he said, "The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election." He also accused the Democrats of using COVID to steal the election and called the decision to expand mail-in voting the greatest scam in the history of politics. So this is the autocrat telling you exactly what he's going to do. He's going to try and steal this election. And this is precisely in line with the type of tactics that the GOP has used in order to suppress the vote, through voter suppression, undermining confidence in elections, and using arcane laws and right-wing courts to further their unpopular and undemocratic agenda.
So that's where we are. We're talking about a person who is way behind in the polls, thrashing around trying to find a way out of that circumstance. And we're going to be talking about the mechanics of this, because sometimes when you put it all together and you're like, plot to steal the election, it's a little bit, go get your tinfoil hat and join us. That is not where we are going with this today. Where we are going today is into a deep dive into the arcane and I think totally fascinating mechanisms of our system and areas of law that could allow this sort of slow motion coup to take place. And we're talking about this because we actually know all of these details. And if you know the details of a really bad thing that might happen, you are empowered to take actions, the actions necessary to prevent that bad thing from happening. So we are talking about all of this in hopes that we will be wrong, in hopes that there will be such a landslide result in this election that it will be completely clear there will be no chaos and no potential for anyone to take advantage of that chaos and create an undemocratic disaster. But if we don't know about this stuff, if we don't talk about it in detail with you, we're headed for disaster. So before we go on, all of what we're going to be talking about today is rooted in an understanding of the Electoral College. So Alana, would you please talk us through the Electoral College and the role it plays here?
Absolutely. So quick refresher on the Electoral College. When we go and cast our votes, we're not actually voting for the candidates who are on the pieces of paper that we vote on. We are voting for electors, meaning people who will vote for the candidate in the Electoral College. And normally, when a candidate wins most of the votes in the state, that state will appoint those electors to vote in the Electoral College who support that candidate. But if there is a question about which candidate won the most votes in a state, Republicans can exploit these ambiguities in the Constitution and the federal law to appoint fraudulent electors to the Electoral College and try to overturn the results of the election.
And keep in mind, like what we're talking about is a thing that depends on chaos, right? It's a thing that only can arise from questions over who actually won the vote. So that's why this year is especially dangerous, right? Because we are in a pandemic. We are in an historic election. We are in a year when there are more likely to be questions coming out of the mechanisms that we're using to vote and the weird suppression tactics that we're seeing right now on the vote. And two of the things we want to sort of kick off with here that are very, very important are the idea of a blue shift and a red mirage. It sounds like Star Trek stuff, but here's what it means. These are terms coined by Professor Ned Foley of Ohio State University. He is like the ultimate reputable thinker on these issues. He's a chaired professor in constitutional law. He's a prestigious, America Law Institute member. He's written books on election law. They are published by Oxford University Press. He's won, legal history scholarship awards for his research on elections. He's a very serious person with a really serious idea that just has like awesomely dramatic terminology. So what we're talking about is this is a year when there is a pandemic. And because there's a pandemic, a lot of states are expanding access to mail-in voting or absentee voting. They are the same thing. This is in an attempt to make people feel safer exercising their franchise, right? If you're scared to go to the polls because you are vulnerable or you don't want to risk exposure, this is another alternative you can use. However, when you see a huge increase in mail-in voting due to COVID this year, and when you consider the fact that the people who use mail-in voting are drastically skewed towards being Democrats for a number of reasons. One, because the president keeps claiming without basis that mail-in voting is fraudulent, which it is not. And two, because Democrats tend to have been more careful about pandemic precautions. We're looking at a situation where the people actually voting in person on election day are more likely to be Trump voters, and the people voting in advance by mail-in ballot are more likely to be Biden voters. Here's where this gets a little bit wild. If it were me and I were running the system, I would say, okay, we're going to just count these ballots as we get them, right? We're getting ballots. We're going to be getting ballots for months. We have a lot of like millions of these things to count. Like, let's get a jump on it so that we're not overwhelmed on election day.
Makes sense.
It does. Wouldn't that see? I should be in charge of stuff,
really
but
should.
I am not. And the states that are, many of them are making decisions. Just going to like put all the mail-in ballots in a closet and count them all at one time after election day, which is obviously going to delay results dramatically. It's also going to lead to the red mirage and the blue shift. Okay, so the red mirage it's election night in America, right? We're watching precincts reporting, and the precincts are reporting in-person voting. And what did we learn before? In-person voting at the last minute on election day is going to be skewed toward Trump voters. So we're seeing returns that look like a Trump victory. However, when you start counting the mail-in ballots, that margin of victory starts to erode, and the results start skewing more and more towards Joe Biden. That's called the blue shift. Now, this is something we've seen a lot of times before. Mail-in ballots historically have shifted margins in many states, in many places. This is not in any way a new thing, but because we have an out-of-control pandemic, it is probably going to be more so this year. That means that Trump may appear to be winning on election day, but see his lead disappear in the blue shift. And of course, we can all probably guess how he's going to react to that.
Right. And like you're saying, this blue shift is nothing new. In fact, Professor Foley in this article goes through several examples dating all the way more than 10 years ago that the blue shift has been happening. So he talks about Pennsylvania specifically. Pennsylvania 2016 presidential election. Trump is in the lead, and we see that his lead begins to narrow from election day to the day where all of the votes are counted by 23,659 votes. And that's just not in the presidential election. This has also happened in other races. So state governor races and also Senate races. So we saw it in the midterm elections as well in 2018. Democratic candidates for both governor and United States senator in Pennsylvania increased their leads over the Republican opponents by over 28,000 votes during that same period during the midterm election. And in each of the presidential elections before 2016, so 2004, 2008, 2012, the Democratic candidates gained over 22,000 votes in Pennsylvania between election night and the final certification of the official results. And, in Arizona in 2018, this blue shift made a huge difference in that election. So in that election, We had the Republican candidate, Martha McSally, who on election day or the day after election day held a lead of 15,403 votes over her opponent, Kirsten Sinema. But then between that time,
this one was crazy. I love this one.
I know, right? Between election day and the time when all the votes were counted, she gained 71,303 votes. Well, I'm sorry, she gained 55,900 votes, making it so that she had a 71,303 vote gain during that process. So 55,900 votes is what she gained. And so she gained 71,303 votes during the counting process. And experts have provided so many different explanations, likely explanations for the blue shift. First and foremost, it takes a long time to count and certify hundreds of thousands and millions of ballots. But there are also lots of other reasons why it goes in the blue direction. Specifically, after 2000, there were a lot of different voting laws that changed. Most specifically, the use of provisional ballots, which tend to be cast by voters of demographic groups who support Democratic candidates. And there are likely other causes as well. But what this all says is that, the reason isn't fraud. It's not because these ballots are, fraudulently cast. There's no evidence to support that fraud is the reason why things go blue. But we do know that they do go blue.
Yeah, so let's be clear. There is reality, and then there's what the president says about reality, and those two things are often wildly divergent. So, knowing that this blue shift has never been linked to fraud. It's not because of fraud. It's not due to anything illegal. It's just due to the mechanics of who votes how. That has not stopped Trump and the Republicans from launching this deceptive campaign to equate mail-in voting with fraud, mail-in voting with schemes. I think my favorite phrase is that they've been referring to the blue shift as the blue steel. I do not think this is a Zoolander reference. If it is a Zoolander reference, I would be deeply amused, but I don't think it is. But yeah, they're trying to basically say the blue shift, illegitimate. Anything that happens after the election, illegitimate. In fact, they keep referring to the election as game day. Steve Bannon just did it the other day. He referred to Trump's game day vote. This is a football match, as opposed to a decision regarding the future of our nation. They're trying to convince people that the one true vote count happens on election day, which is completely divorced from the reality of how people are voting and what is necessary to count all of the millions of votes in this nation. But just yesterday on his podcast, he was saying that Democrats were changing election laws. They can steal this election from President Trump's game day vote. What this brings to mind for me is it's if Donald Trump is a reality TV person, which he is, he wants you to think that election day is the season finale. It is not. It's kicking off a whole new season of counting and measuring and, probably litigation. So the reason we talk about all of this is injecting chaos into this moment is crucial for the rest of the plot we're going to discuss to work. If there is no chaos, if it is clear who won the election, if there is a landslide for Joe Biden, none of the tactics we're going to talk about next would work. But with chaos, what's that line from Game of Thrones? Chaos is a ladder. Chaos is the key, right? Creating chaos is the key to opening possibilities for litigation and legal mechanisms that could result in a presidency that directly contravenes the will of the voters. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of normal inconsistencies about vote counting, right? Anytime you're trying to manage millions of people, for example, differences between the number of people that signed the sign-in sheet at the precinct and the number of ballots you end up with at the end of the day. Anyone who's ever worked in a restaurant knows that sometimes there's a 3-cent difference between your checks and your till, and it's not the same as a $500 difference. Differences, imperfect signatures on mail-in ballots or naked ballots. We just saw that great ad campaign with a bunch of people getting naked and warning you to put your ballot in a security envelope. Delays due to the fact that, we have a postal service that is significantly less functional now than it used to be because of the destruction of mail sorting machines. Ballots that were postmarked before election but arrive really, really late because the postal service isn't working the way it should be. Other tactics, in Texas, we're going to talk about having only one drop-off spot per county. Anyway, all of this chaos lets the Republicans claim that the shift is due to fraud and evidence of an illegitimate election.
But it's not due to fraud, and that's something we know. We know that that instances of voter fraud are very rare, but this smokescreen is crucial to Trump's plan, and he's going to use every tool at his disposal to implement this plan. There was a recent article in the New York Times where U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance told the New York Times that Trump was using his DOJ to, quote, build a narrative despite the evidence of voter fraud in mail-in, despite the absence of any evidence of fraud in mail-in voting, so Trump can challenge the election results if he loses. We don't even just have to look at that quote. We can also look at what he did in 2018. So in that election, he and other members of the Republican Party, when he saw that the blue shift was starting to occur after election night, he tweeted, "The Florida election should be called in favor of Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis in the large number of new ballots that showed up out of nowhere. And Melanie ballots are missing or forged. An honest vote count is no longer possible. Must go," and he does this in all caps, "must go with election night." Now, he says out of nowhere. I mean, these ballots aren't from out of nowhere. They're people who mail in their ballots.
They are out of the Postal Service, which it is actually a federal crime to tamper with. So I'm a person who learns by example. I need like really concrete examples to understand stuff. So let's spell out what this might look like in practice, right? This is, again, coming from Professor Foley, who we've been discussing. Let's imagine election night in Pennsylvania. Biden wins. Pennsylvania's governor fills out the certificate of attainment, or certificate of ascertainment, forgive me, notifying the federal government that the electors for Joe Biden have been officially appointed as the state's electors. So as Biden's electors prepare to cast their Electoral College votes, as we know, the votes that actually matter, because we live in a system where the popular vote is not the one that matters, the GOP-controlled state legislature, at Trump's urging and tweeting and poking and prodding, purports to exercise their authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to appoint the state's presidential electors directly. Basically, they'd have to claim that something was so wrong with the popular vote that it could not be trusted, had to be thrown out, and they, the electors of the state, were going to completely cut the people out of this process and send a slate of Trump electors to vote in the Electoral College. They're going to, this could happen very easily if they could say, well, look, on election night on game day, there was a Trump lead, and then all of these ballots came out of nowhere, and now there's a big Biden lead, but we're just going to appoint the electors that reflect the result on election night.
And in this scenario, the governor, of course, will fight it. But then the legislature says, we can do this. There's been precedent for this before, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And so they will send their 20 electors to vote in the Electoral College. And when Congress meets in January to count the Electoral College votes from the states, there are two conflicting certificates of votes from Pennsylvania, one for each candidate. And from there, it's up to Congress. They're the ones who decide which votes to count. And there are a whole number of complicated scenarios here, which we'll go into in a minute. But the bottom line is that this could create a crisis and potentially end with Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes going to Trump. And Professor Foley specifically talks about Pennsylvania in this example, but this isn't just limited to Pennsylvania, right? Like, there are other states. You could probably talk about that, Emily.
Indeed. So Republicans control both. I want to look at my notes here. Republicans control both chambers of the legislature in 6 of the top battleground states. So that's Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In Arizona and Florida, the governors are also Republican. So basically, the reason that matters, and we're going to talk about this in a second, is if there's competing slates of electors, right? If the governor says Biden guys go or Biden people go, and the legislature says Trump people go, that conflict isn't going to happen in a state where the governor and the legislature are of the same party, or it's less likely to happen. So in states where all branches of government are controlled by the same party, there's no immediate check on the ability of the people in power to substitute their choice for the choice of the people in the state and appoint fraudulent electors. Now, all of this, I'm going to go back. I'm a person who starts to panic. And so I'm going to go, if you're panicking like me, I'm going to go back and say, like, all of this depends on Trump having a lead on election night. So if Trump doesn't have that game day lead, decisions about attempting to sort of subvert the will of the people in a given state would be really, really challenging, and also subject to a lot of Electoral College math. And I think that it's very unlikely they would try this in states that he doesn't need to win. But I am not a good Donald Trump predictor. So who is a good Donald Trump predictor? Anyway.
I mean, not me, but I do have the question of, like, how is this legal? How can he do this?
Okay, Alana and I, if you saw the last show, you know that we're both former public defenders. And so I'm going to fall back on something we learned as public defenders, which is that there's the law and what it says. And then there's the way people with the power to interpret the law, like, do things with the law. And often those two things have nothing to do with each other. Like, the law, we like to pretend like we live in a country where the law is clear and governing and paramount, and it is equally applied to all people. But in fact, we live in a country where the law is what decision makers say it is and interpret it to be. And this brings the Supreme Court really deeply into the conversation, right? So what the law is and what the law does and gets interpreted as can be wildly different things. That's why violating norms and breaking rules and creating this world in which people can do things that are dramatically out of step with anything we've ever seen historically is so terrifying, right? It means we don't really have laws that are meaningful. So, and ultimately, Congress chooses the president, and the courts can't intervene once fraudulent electors are sent to Congress. That's the nightmare scenario, right? Like, even if what Republicans did was illegal, once they send the electors to Congress, it's up to Congress to choose which slate of electors to go with. And there is law on this, and we're going to talk about it. But I just wanted to flag that we're also, like, a little bit in public defender world here. It's up to Congress to decide which electors they go with. Now, this is also, like, incredibly rare. This mess is phenomenally rare. But there's one time when it happened before, and it changed the course of American history. And that was in the election of 1876. Alana, can you tell us what happened in 1876?
Yeah, so there's this really great article in the Washington Post by Richard Kreitner on this that I recommend everybody go read. But in that article, it talks about the election of 1876 between New York Governor Samuel Tilden versus decorated Union General Rutherford B. Hayes. Tilden won the popular vote and seemingly the Electoral College. But Hayes' allies in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida sought to invalidate the outcome of that vote, but for valid reasons. There was actually voter intimidation and violence at polling booths, and for that reason, they sent a competing slate of electors. They were unable to reach an agreement, and so we had these three states that had competing electors. And so just 2 weeks before the inauguration, Congress agreed to form a 15-person commission composed equally of senators, representatives, and Supreme Court justices. They were tasked with sorting out these different votes. And Tilden's supporters, so they decided that the votes went to Hayes, and Hayes was the person who was rightfully going to be president because of that. Tilden's supporters, though, moved to block certification of the results to force a new election, but a compromise was eventually reached. And this is the really sort of devastating part about all of it. The compromise was that Hayes would withdraw his troops from the South, who were helping to ensure the civil rights of Black Americans living there. And that was the beginning of the end, or that was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow laws.
It's in this moment really horrifying to think about how the last time this happened, it led to this twist in American history, with the Jim Crow era. So there's lots of articles right now that are talking about 1876 and drawing on this scenario that could unfold. Alana, what do you think is, like, the cultural comparison today Like, what is the horrifying trade-off we could be looking at right now?
Yeah. So when I think about that election and I think about what it means for today, it means violence, uncertainty. But what it really means is that we're looking at long-term consequences if the Democrats don't stand up and fight back. If the Democratic Party isn't strong, we could end up with policies that really hurt people. In the election of 1876, the true winner allowed himself to get strong-armed into getting rid of civil rights for Black Americans. He gave in. He didn't fight back. He gave into these demands, and he did it sort of for the sake of like calming things down, it seems. And so when I think about that, I think about the Democrats of today. And I think about how there's been a constant attempt to take the high road, to be civil, to be polite. And what we're seeing is that's not always the right thing to do because people's lives are at stake. People's well-being are at stake in this country. So, for example, the civility that the Democrats demonstrated during Merrick Garland's nomination is doing nothing to help the Democrats right now. The Republicans are refusing to demonstrate that same civility since the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And as a result, we could have one of the most dangerous Supreme Courts that we've seen in recent history. A Supreme Court that will take medical care away from so many Americans. And so, and also Trump has been appointing far-right judicial nominees to lifetime appointments to seats that Republicans have held open since the Obama presidency or held during the Obama presidency. And so we're really seeing that, like, if Democrats don't do the right thing and stand up because they want to be civil, it could be dangerous for this country.
Like we said last time, this is not a boxing match. This is a fight in an alley behind a bar. So looking at history to understand what's at stake here, it takes us to the results of that sort of catastrophic failure of our system in 1876, which led to the 1887 passage of the Electoral Count Act. I really wish we had sound effects in this show so we could have like a little theme music for the Electoral Count Act. Here it comes. You've always wanted to know about it, and now we'll tell you. So the Electoral Count Act is still in effect today. It is 19th century law. It remains key now for this election. And what it says is this. It puts basically a timeline in place that elections have to adhere to. It requires that the electors who are going to vote in the Electoral College be chosen, set, all done with, sent no more than 41 days after Election Day. So this year, that's December 14th. December 14th, those slates of electors better be on their way. That means that about a week before, there's what's called the safe harbor deadline. And what that is the deadline by which states must know which electors they're going to pick. In other words, states need to know who won their election in their state. This year, that date is December 14th, which means that in all of the chaos and all of the mail-in ballots and whatever litigation is happening and other forms of chaos, states need to, within that strict timeline, figure out who won their state election, count all the ballots, recount the ballots if they have to, et cetera. Any votes I'm sorry, I said December 14th. That was a crucial mistake, and I don't want to let that stand. The date by which the electors have to go is December 14th. The date by which all of the votes have to be counted, squared away, the safe harbor date, is December 8th. Any votes not counted by December 8th are at risk of not being counted at all. Under normal circumstances, like 35 days might be enough time to figure out who won your election in your state. But this year, knowing how much deliberate injection of chaos there's been and just world chaos and voter suppression tactics and pandemic, the tactics that could slow down counting after November 3rd are incredibly frightening.
And the Electoral Count Act doesn't make this any easier for us to be able to clear up. So in fact, there was a group of the nation's leading scholars and election law experts, including Professor Foley, who we've been talking about this whole episode, wrote a report in April where various different scenarios that could happen in the 2020 elections were laid out. And in that report, they called the Electoral Count Act a morass of ambiguity, which is the exact opposite of what is required in the event of a contested election. In that report, the committee recommended more than a dozen changes to the way elections are run. Very few of those changes were implemented. I wonder why. And so this takes us back to the Pennsylvania example from Professor Foley's article. So we left off with the Republican-controlled legislature having successfully gotten their electors in front of Congress. And under the Electoral Count Act, Congress gets to decide which of these two set of electors to accept. And when I say Congress, this is the new Congress. So the Congress that is in office after you all vote. And so in the case of disagreement between the chambers, the Electoral Count Act provides another contingency. The act states that the electors certified by the executive of the state are the ones that get counted. And for the contested Pennsylvania electors, Democrats would argue that the Biden electors, which were approved by the state's governor, must be counted.
Yep, this is, I think this is my tiny raft of hope. We are now sailing away on my tiny raft of hope because there was a great article that came out recently by three celebrated law professors and experts in this field, Neil Buchanan, Michael Dorf, and Lawrence Tribe. And they basically wrote that this is game, set, match, right? They argue that the plain meaning of these words, the executive of the state chooses which slate of electors, means that the governor's slate of electors must win out. And that would mean that in any state with a governor who was certifying a Biden victory, there would be no ability for the Trump campaign to try and subvert that. However, we also live in a world where we have learned repeatedly over the last 4 years that this is a campaign that does not give up easily. That's the most polite way I've ever put it. So we know the Trump campaign isn't just going to give up and go home. They might challenge the Electoral Count Act as unconstitutional and basically say that a procedure that has, details that go beyond Article 2 of the Constitution or what's in the 12th Amendment is illegitimate. That would mean that in our example, with Pennsylvania's ballots still in dispute, the Trump campaign could argue that the duty of presidential selection falls now to the House of Representatives. This is the next stage. We keep going through these stages of decision making. So now we're in the next stage, the 12th Amendment process. And in that process, each state delegation in the House gets one vote as to which president they pick. That's significant because when we think of the House right now, we're like, the House is all Democrats. Actually, the House has 26 Republican state delegations, which means that the House would likely select, in our scenario, in our example, the Trump electors. Now, that's dependent, as Alana pointed out a minute ago, the House who would be deciding this is the post-election House, right? So there's, for example, a race right now in Montana where one of those delegations could get flipped to be a Democrat delegation. And if the candidate in Montana wins their race, suddenly we have a different balance of delegations in the House. So we don't know how the House will be composed at this point. But in the current House, Republicans would have the edge with 26 out of 50 state delegations. Now, again, going back to that Buchanan and Dorf and Tribe article, they argue that it is not likely to come to this point, right? That it is likelier that with an irresolvable dispute over which slate of electors to pick, probably what should happen is that Pennsylvania would just get kind of taken out of the Electoral College mix. Can't pick the electors, which means we're not going to count either slate, but we're also not going to count Pennsylvania's Electoral College votes in the total needed to win. So that would mean, again, you would just take Pennsylvania out, majority wins. And there's other possibilities as well. In another scenario, Trump could argue that Vice President Mike Pence, as president of the Senate, has the exclusive constitutional authority to choose which slate of electors to count. I think it is safe to assume that Mike Pence would probably choose the Trump electors. But there's even a situation, opposite world from that, where unable to choose any slate of electors and unable to resolve this by Inauguration Day on January 20th, We see John Roberts swearing in Nancy Pelosi. Because if you can't pick a president or a vice president, the next person in the line of succession is Nancy Pelosi. Alana, you got any scenarios?
I mean, we could run through scenarios all day. But really, the point is this. The GOP is going to do everything they can. And the Electoral Count Act is all over the place. And the GOP will try everything it can within that and to interpret that in a way to allow them to win. And the Democrats need to get along with the program and be willing to match that energy. And like we've said last episode, like we'll tell you again today, norms, decency, all of those sorts of things are out the window. Because if the Democrats don't match the Republicans in this match, the Republicans will win despite whether or not they actually won the vote. So it's really important that the Democrats only concede if they know that they did not get the votes.
And it's also really important to point out, just like taking a step back again, the reason the voting matters is not just about if there's a landslide result on election night, none of this is going to happen. But also when we talk about decisions being made by the Senate, by the House of Representatives, we're talking about the Senate and the House as they would be composed post-election. So like if Democrats flip the Senate, it's a totally different conversation. Anyway, taking a step back, it's tempting to wonder why Democrats would ever give up or concede or do something elegant but disastrous in the face of this sort of existential threat to democracy. But I think we have to remember that none of the stuff we're talking about will be happening in like a calm and peaceful vacuum. It will be happening in a country where there could be mass unrest. There could be protests in the streets. There could be, there will likely still be a pandemic. There could be violence. There could be Trump constantly tweeting that he is the rightful winner and that he's not leaving the White House, and really frightening rhetoric coming out of the executive branch. He will mercilessly attack his political opponents and baselessly accuse them of all sorts of things. I'm sure there will be a way to bring Hillary's emails into it. I don't know what that will be, but it will happen. And we're talking about fake news and demanding investigations from Bill Barr's DOJ, which, as we know, has recently seemed very willing to engage in things at the behest of the president, things that DOJ might not ordinarily do. So we're talking about a world in which the flames of hatred and division that we have all been horrified to see rising and becoming more overt and more violent in this country will be fanned. And there will be rhetoric that is unprecedented and frightening. The more chaos there is, the more frightened people are, the more this pushes states to do things they might not ordinarily do. And so we're essentially talking about a world in which Democrats might be making decisions in a country, where COVID relief is withheld, where the executive is holding the country hostage. Yeah, let's take a breath.
Yeah, let's take a breath, because this is some serious, scary stuff. And part of the scariest thing about this is that Trump may not even be planning to legitimately win this battle. He may just be hoping to, he might take it to the bitter end. And we actually might have that scenario that you were talking about last episode, Emily, where he's, barricading the doors of the Oval Office, sitting on the floor saying, "I'm not leaving, I don't care." Yeah. Which is funny to think about on one sense, but also is really scary. And that's the state that we're in right now.
We're going to hope that Democrats learn the lesson from Bush v. Gore, where Gore could have not conceded. He could have exhausted more or all of his options, rather than choosing political decency. So if Biden goes that route, we will pay a much greater price. But again, that's why we're talking about this. That's why we're going to be talking about this with you, making a plan, unpacking the information that's available. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is Alana Sivan. This has been The Count. I hope you will join us at the same time Monday, when we're going to actually have our first guest, Lawrence Douglas, a professor of law at Amherst College and the author of Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Election Meltdown of 2020. I will see you there and then.